Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the panel discussion on Budget 2022 and the Indian economy, prospects for growth and macroeconomic stability. This panel discussion is jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and the Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We would like to acknowledge the presence of the High Commissioner of India to Singapore, His Excellency Mr. P. Kumaran, amongst us today. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if you could switch off your videos and mute your microphones throughout the session. If you have any questions, please forward them via the Zoom chat. We will consolidate the questions for the panelists to answer during the question and answer session. We are pleased to inform you that today's panel discussion is being live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us the following distinguished panel of speakers: Dr. Bornali Bhandari, Senior Fellow, National Council of Applied Economic Research, India; Ms. Radhika Rao, Senior Vice President and Economist, DBS Bank, Singapore; Mr. Manish Tripathi, Vice Chairman, Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry; Dr. Sachin Shukla, Chief Economist, Mahindra Group, India; and Dr. Amithendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economic Policy, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. Chairing the session is Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at ISAS and former Comptroller and Auditor General, Government of India. I shall now pass the floor to Mr. Rai to begin the proceedings. Over to you, Mr. Rai.
Thank you, Divya. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this discussion, which is a panel discussion organized between ISAS and the Singapore Institution of Chambers of Commerce and Industry. We will be discussing Budget 2022 and the Indian economy, prospects for growth and macroeconomic stability. I'd love to welcome all of you, and I'm very delighted to know that Mr. Kumaran, the High Commissioner of India to Singapore, is amidst us today. Just to give you a broad overview, the growth versus consolidating fiscal deficit debate will continue till the end of times. And there are no easy answers or perfect solutions to this. The Indian government's macroeconomic strategy, and as articulated through the budget, seems to be that growth will take care of all the problems that the economy faces. Hence, the budget is characterized by a continued emphasis on high capital expenditure on infrastructure projects to sustain growth momentum in the short term. Now, it hopes that this strategy will succeed in kickstarting the income multiplier benefits, with income of the lower strata being boosted through employment generation via these infra projects. Now, this strategy also appears to be premised on the fact that banks seem to have improved the health of their balance sheets, and capital adequacy as of now is not an issue. Added to it is the fact that the bad bank may soon take over their stressed assets. The National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development, the NABFID as it's called, has been devolved to rupees 200 billion from the current budget. The money has already been made available to the bank. Riding on the wave of higher than projected tax collections, the government seems to have opted for a more modest consolidation next year with very credible, and I'm saying credible and reasonable, projections of revenues and expenditures. To that extent, government projecting a rate of growth of 7 to 8% in 2022-23, when the present rate is 9.2%, appears to be credible and hence realistic. However, this recovery will not wipe out the deleterious effects of the pandemic, though it would certainly help in generating revenue for the government, thereby clearly helping to lessen the fiscal deficit and public debt problems. Now, what we need to debate is whether the K-shaped recovery, which seems to have become the growth pattern for the economy over the last 2 years, can really be overcome, leading to employment generation and poverty alleviation, which have suffered very severely in these 2 years. Now, I say this because studies conducted by the Azim Premji University indicate that the pandemic has pushed 230 million people below the poverty line. Government has to be cognizant of the challenges that the global economy is facing, and that export demand which seems to be looking up now, may taper with rising rates that the global economy might be confronted with. The worldwide crypto community has lauded India's announcement to tax cryptocurrencies and develop a likely blockchain-based regulator-backed digital currency as a significant step forward, legitimizing the asset class and encouraging innovation in blockchain technology. Now, the tax clarity on digital currency transactions is a very positive step forward. The Indian government is taking a progressive stance by going ahead in the direction of innovation. And by bringing in taxation, the government seems to be legitimizing the crypto industry and trading to a large extent. This makes it now possible for institutions that have been sitting on the sidelines because of uncertainty on this aspect to come forward and participating in this emerging market and industry with their investments. Even if the taxable rate is 30%, is considered relatively high, any form of government regulation of cryptocurrency is encouraging, as it goes a long way towards validating the asset and making it more mainstream and widely accepted in everyday business and commerce. Now, global crypto experts believe, and I'm sure Mr. Manish Tripathi will throw some light on it, that government's announcement of 1% tax deduction at source at the time of transfer of digital assets will become a powerful tool to track transactions. And that is going to be a plus factor for the government. Also, in an attempt to broaden the tax base, the government had announced a new tax regime in the budget of 2020. The new regime has fewer and lower tax slabs, but withdraws exemptions available under the old regime. Taxpayers have had the liberty to choose between the old and new regime, and those choosing the latter had to forego deductions and exemptions such as standard deduction, leave travel allowances, and house rent allowance. Now, in the current budget, the government has not tinkered with any of the rates, with the objective of having a simpler regime with flat and low rates and fewer exemptions. Such a move will certainly move the burden of taxation onto the rich also. Now, India, I must acknowledge, has an unenviable reputation of being a litigation-prone tax jurisdiction. For example, in 2014-15, about rupees 2.1 trillion had been under dispute for a duration between 1 and 2 years. By 2020-21, this number has increased more than threefold to rupees 6.6 trillion. An underlying cause for litigation were abundance of loopholes in very complex tax regime. Therefore, it is heartening that the overarching aim of direct tax policy reform is to move towards a simpler regime without exemption and with low rates. Clearly, a less taxing state with simpler rules will reduce tax litigation and become more attractive. Now, of course, India has made very bold pronouncements in COP26, and rightly so too, as the focus on climate control is a need of the hour. The budget aims to establish special mobility zones with zero fossil fuel policy and put in place a battery swapping policy to encourage battery or energy as a service business case. Now, all said, I would still have liked to hear more, and I'm leaving it to the panelists to hear from the government or the budget about plans to make good the learning loss that has occurred. Learning loss in the nature of millions of students having missed school and classes because they did not have access to online learning. Bringing students back to school and ensuring that there is no category of dropouts is of prime importance, and as it would nullify years of effort to ensure that all children of school-going age do get to school or do get to enjoy school. It would also have been nicer to hear from what the government's plans are on health issues protection of the community of all age groups from further waves of the pandemic in terms of vaccines and other infrastructural preparedness. Lastly, I would also have liked to hear more about how contact-intensive services, such as maybe travel, tourism, restaurants, cinemas, parlors, etc., are proposed to be revived, as these have taken a very intensive beating. Now, some of these issues which I've just flagged, which will help some of our panelists to throw light on them, we propose to have a very vibrant and intensive discussion on these issues. And with all of your permission, I will first call upon Dr. Barnali Bhandari to hold the stage and give us the benefit of her views. Dr. Bhandari.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me. Thank you to ISIS, and thank you to Singapore Chamber of Commerce and Industry for inviting me. The stage is set. So before I sort of point out the key issues in the budget or the key points in the budget, I just want to say that I want to emphasize Dr. Rai's point that this is a very, very challenging time for us. The COVID crisis comes at a very critical time. So in the sense is that India was in India, as you know, the replacement rate is started to fall. And in terms of the long term, the demographic dividend, we were in the next 10 years, were in a position to actually reap our demographic dividend. But what we find is that as children have lost 2 years of school, and that means, and of course, serious challenge losses to education and skilling, which means we'll have a lot of young population, but not educated or neither educated nor skilled, and not on the other side, not producing enough jobs to absorb them. So, so the next, and that means India has to grow. India has to grow, and India has to grow beyond 7% to actually catch up. Because even if it does, we have done some simulation exercise. We did some simulation exercise last year, and we found that even if India grows at 7%, even then it will take India 10 years to catch up to the pre-pandemic growth path. So that is where India is, and with that, I turn to the short term, or where in India, or where what the budget tells us. So the first key point is that India is there was a pre-pandemic slowdown. There was a pre-pandemic slowdown even before COVID hit us. Indian GDP growth fell from the high of 8.3% in 16-17 to 3.7% in 19-20. And then, of course, the COVID came and our GDP contracted by 6.6%. India is poised to recover with a 9.2% growth rate. That's a projected growth rate. It may be slightly dampened because of the third wave, but all the numbers are showing so far that India has caught up with the pre-pandemic growth path. Sorry.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. So based on the numbers that we have seen, what we see is that if India did not catch up with had not caught up with the pre-pandemic level of GDP level till the first half of this financial year, but it will catch up in the next half, or projected to catch up in the next half of the financial year. That's where GDP is. When we look at sectoral composition of GDP, we looked at is another point is when somebody asked is what factors contributed to the Indian slowdown pre-pandemic. And the factors there's up for debate. There were both cyclical and structural reasons that have been debated on. The Arvind Subramaniam set of peer body of work actually points out to that the slowdown in exports and investment, especially post 2011-12, contributed to the slowdown in growth, coupled with the twin balance sheet problem, which expanded to the 4 balance sheet problems. So there were a host of reasons which led to the slowdown, but there is some ongoing research at NCR which will hopefully show some more light on this issue as what exactly contributed to the slowdown. So even if we catch up to the 19-20 pre-pandemic growth path, we still would catch up to a much lower growth path than our potential is. The second point is that what within the GDP, within the Indian economy, which sectors contributed to the slowdown? What we know, if you analyze the numbers, it's showing that essentially it was only agriculture sector which actually had a positive growth that particular year in the COVID pandemic year, that held up the economy. Rest of the other sectors actually did have a slowdown. And of course, when we see, as predicted by economic theory also, as that the industry sector is the one which recovered faster and quicker, and where we would use the words V-shaped recovery. But the services sector has been a little slower, especially the contact intensive sectors, even if the trade sector especially is still not going to catch up with the pre-pandemic growth path levels even after this year. So it's going to take some time before we catch up. So there is sectoral differences on on the impact of the COVID. While we think that COVID has not affected agriculture and it has tended to do well, when we look at the growth path of agriculture, why is agriculture important? While it just forms 15% of GDP, actually approximately 15%, it may vary here and there, but it employs 45% of our population, of our workforce. So it's a very significant sector for us. And within that 45%, it also, the numbers show that agriculture also became a shock absorber for our labor force during this period of time. So it is absolutely important to look at agriculture. So the agriculture sector has had positive growth rates, but compared to but it shows a volatile growth path. Gross capital formation in the agriculture sector shows volatile growth path. And more or less in the last couple of years, since 16-17, the gross capital formation to output ratio has remained constant. The main, and what we see is that agricultural exports have actually gone up from less than 10% to more than 10% between the last between 14 and 21, between 17. Plus, what we see is that agriculture export destinations have widened. There's been a lot of effort, as documented by the Economic Survey, to increase to improve focus on agriculture exports. Another thing that we see is agriculture itself, the share of crops, which is still quite large, food grains mostly, that the share of that has reduced, and the share has moved to the emphasis has moved to more lively animal husbandry and fishing industries, and where we see also a rise and spurt in exports. So there is dynamism in the agriculture sector, but unfortunately there's a but, and as Dr. Rice set out, the K-shaped recovery, this becomes quite evident here, because when we look at income, nominal income actually has gone up between 14 to 21 for the average agricultural household. The nominal income has gone up from 6,000 approximately to 10,000 rupees, which is documented in the Economic Survey. But when you actually I'm not talking about the methodology of income, but if you just look at the real incomes have actually remained stagnant. It has shown positive growth of CAGR of 1.5%. So essentially, it has remained stagnant for the last 7 years, and that's where the problem is. That real incomes of farmers have actually, or the agricultural households have remained stagnant, and less than a slower portion of incomes are now, share of incomes are coming from agricultural income, what we think of a standard farmer income. Instead, it are coming from non-agriculture incomes, like livelihoods from animal husbandry and other wages. So that's where the farmers, even then it has stagnated. So when you look at the agricultural budget, the emphasis of the budget is actually on providing income support. PM Kisan, the Pradhan Mantri PM Kisan scheme, which is an income support scheme for farmers, is 51% of the total Ministry of Agricultural budget. Unfortunately, what we find is that the productivity, even though it has shown improvement, but it's still much lower than compared to the rest of the world. In India, there is tremendous difference, state level variations in agriculture. we find that there is tremendous potential. Even though irrigation has improved, there's still potential for growth. Farmer mechanization is still low, and both have potential for growth. And and again, they might have improved, but they're much lower than compared to the rest of the world. When we actually see the budget, we find the budget allocations for key things to improve productivity, agricultural productivity, there's a more focus on income support versus focus on agricultural productivity, like irrigation or farmer mechanization. So there is a shift away, but that does not mean that, but in the other cases, we find that the agricultural support for fishing and animal husbandry has gone up. So the budget is also responding to the changes in the dynamic changes in the agricultural sector. So that's something to think about also. But yes, there could be more done for agricultural, improving agricultural productivity. So that is very important. 2 more minutes to make 2 points. The employment is, and becoming, if we now look at employment, that, as I said, 46% of the agriculture became a shock absorber for the COVID pandemic. But when we look at overall employment, what we find is, of course, it's not surprising that unemployment went up during the pandemic, and it has slowly recovered, it has gone down. But that's not the main point. What we find is that there are differences across gender. The female unemployment rates have actually recovered at a much slower pace than the male unemployment rates. Youth unemployment rates they tend to be higher anyway. And of course, they went up much more during the pandemic. And that comes sort of brings back to the education and skills point. What we needed at this point is, as schools are opening up after the third wave, are remedial classes. And we find there is an emphasis on remedial classes, but through online learning. While that does make sense, that does kind of make sense in the senses because the outreach is higher. But what we find is that we know from from our own research that the digital divide in India is quite high, and unless state governments are trying to help by helping families get over the digital divide, but it's not enough. So that remains a key constraint, and which is going to have even a longer term impact, as I set out in the beginning of my talk, the beginning of the points, that is going to have a longer term impact over the next 10 years as we go forward. I hope I've kept within my time. And
well, thank you very much. That is very interesting and very insightful, because you're drawing attention to the fact that even if we do grow at 7%, it will take us 10 years to catch up with the growth path. Is certainly very disconcerting, and you're absolutely right in pointing towards productivity and employment rates. These are issues which have caused a lot of concern within the country after the budget devolutions were out. Now, with these words, thank you very much, Dr. Bhandari. May I call upon Ms. Radhika Rao to share her views with us? Radhika?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Rai. Thank you, Ms. Bhandari, for setting the stage. I think certainly budget is one of those events which is highly watched, and every sector, be it corporates, be it the farm sector, as well as industry, looks for it with a lot of interest. I also thank ISAS and SICI for arranging this discussion and including me in it. So what I would try to add to this discussion is, first of all, at the very beginning, just very quickly, the global backdrop, global as well as domestic backdrop, has really changed between this year and last year. And I think that, in a way, sets the tone for what the budget did and why the budget carried a certain focus. So if you see the same time last year, the pandemic was, I think it's still in the midst of us, but back then it was the situation was much more dire. We had just had the onset of a new variant. Vaccination wasn't, available very widely. And what you had seen is that most of the central banks and the governments world over were still very much in a stimulative mode. And many of the central banks, we used to consider QE being a very Western concept. But what you did see during the pandemic is many of the Asian countries as well had to participate in their borrowing program to help keep borrowing costs low. So against this backdrop, what you see now is that the environment has changed. vaccination is, most countries have at least got the second dose, or most of the residents have got second dose. Some have got third, and few countries are experimenting with the fourth as well. And the latest variant seems to be much less virulent, even if it's highly transmissible. So we seem to be getting a grasp on the endemic situation and the pandemic situation. And that has allowed the governments and the central banks to begin to consider, exiting this stimulus that has been put in the last 2 years. Of course, various countries moving at various paths. For us, I think now that brings me to the budget proper. And what we do think is that between the central bank and the government, I think that mode is going to change about being very providing much more support to growth versus exiting the stimulus. So from that perspective, I would think the government is still maintaining a growth orientation, and rightfully so, because of various points that Mr. Rai raised as well. It's a K-shaped recovery. Growth still needs some hand holding, but on the other hand, we would think that the central bank would be more faster on the normalization path. So to make key points, I'll split my inputs into 4 C's, right? Just for ease of remembering. The first would be the budget was conservative in its assumptions, right? Conservative and credible to a great extent. And again, this has been the tone in the past 2 budgets, and quite interestingly so, because people of my clan would usually, as soon as the budget is announced, go through the numbers and say, okay, this looks out of place. This is one of the reasons why the deficit is not going to be met. But now the tone has changed. The numbers have become much more credible, much more realistic. If I were to take growth, for example, growth assumption, even for the year we are in, which ends in March, and the year we're going to go into, there is potential for a bit of an upside, about 1.5% on the nominal GDP growth. How that helps is that gives us some cushion, in the math, in case there is a need to step up spending. The second being revenues. So revenues as well, there is the tax buoyancy that has been assumed is conservative. If growth improves, there is a likelihood to an upward bias in revenues, right? The third being divestment. Divestment is again used to be highly ambitious targets, and this time around, I would think that was one of the surprises that came out of the budget, which is that the target that has been set is much lower, which means that if any more assets than what is in the pipeline is able to be sold, you could see higher collections. So that would my first point being, about the budget being more conservative and credible in its assumptions. The second that most of you would have seen, about the Indian budget this time, was most of the headlines screamed capex, right? So being very capex heavy in terms of its spending priorities. And I think on most metrics, that's true. If you see as a percentage of GDP, it's almost a 0.4% increase between the revised estimates for fiscal 22 and 23. If you compare it to pre-COVID levels, it's certainly been almost a 1 percentage point increase. Just again, this has been happening in the past few years, but this year has been exceptionally strong on absolute basis. And also, if you see that tendency to bring off-budget spending on the book is also something that the capex has been doing quite keenly. Then the second question that begs attention is it true, right? Is all the capex money that has been put in, is that true? Is that capex 101? It is. Part of it is. In fact, what the center has done, which is the central government, is that has involved states as well. So they have set aside about 1 lakh crores or 1 trillion rupees for states. So, it helps because they are the ones closer to the ground, and then they will be able to get the last mile spending done. And the quality of expenditure is also improved. And the final point on this part is that, like I said, off budget to on budget. Again, this is a tendency in the past 2 years where the government would like to take on many of the commitments that were previously, the agencies used to go out and raise money. Now the allocations are being made. It's a budget itself. So it kind of gives you a bit of realism to the budget math. The third C, so I did cover the conservative capex, and the third C that I want to touch upon is crowding in or out, right? Again, when the public sector does, or the government does so much of capex spending, and subsequently, not surprisingly, they need to also borrow. though revenues are doing well, I think they do have a significantly higher borrowing program. What then begs the question is, does that mean it's crowding out the private sector? So in these terms, first of all, I do think that the borrowing program that has been outlined, it has come as a rude shock to the bond markets. Any of you who watch the markets very closely must have seen that just following the budget, there has been a 10-12 basis points increase in the yields, short end, part of it in the short end, part of it in the long end, because the bond markets are really concerned about where is the demand going to come from for this kind of supply. But I want to add here that we don't really think that the entire borrowing program will be that big, right? When we do see the final print, which perhaps will be more evident in the second part of the year, we think that the actual borrowing program will be smaller. On a few counts, in the interest of time, I don't want to go into it, but I would think that there is a possibility for the one that's announced in terms of gross is about almost 15 trillion. So I would think that 1.5 trillion reduction is still possible, because revenues could surprise, and then you could have some other sections of financing that might outperform. Nonetheless, at this point, it is quite spooky, so to speak, for the markets in particular. And coming to the crowding out question, I think that's where I think the savings and investment gaps become quite important. When you have this kind of a supply, this kind of a borrowing by the government, we need to see if there are sufficient savings in the domestic system. And we do know that households did save a lot during the pandemic, but I think that savings ratio is now normalizing, right? As the economy is reopening, people are able to go out and about, barring their precautionary savings, they are really using it up to spend as well. So while the savings are going down, the government's dis-savings are rising. And the third point being that we don't nearly have a visibility on global savings coming in. The budget was also supposed to outline a path by which Indian bonds could be included in global indices. We didn't get much clarity on that. So in the immediate term, global savings also might not participate. So in this scenario, I think what you do see is that borrowing costs have begun to go up, and that worry about crowding out remains very much in place. And the final fourth C that I have, which I'll go through very quickly, is the CBDC. Many announcements were made. I think of interest to us was the central bank digital currency. The RBI did, or the government announced a prospect digital rupee that might be outlined during the course of the year. Why does one, go into this venture? Variety of reasons, things like financial inclusion, things like, the monetary authority gets good visibility across the transaction, because the e-wallet or the private players have become quite big. Sometimes you don't get the full information in your money supply, as well as, things like liability on the banks go down to the extent that you're guaranteed that the money that you have remains and it's legal tender. So these are some of the advantages. Again, we can discuss this in further detail, but I would think that this is not something that the central bank would go ahead and do in a hurry. Many other countries around the world, if you look at China, they're still going through trials. If you look at the US, they're still studying the prospects, so is Europe. So we would think this is a great step forward to be in tune with the times, but we don't really expect very quick around time, and because it comes with its own set of concerns. I think with this, I'll stop my bit, and back to you, Mr. Rai.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you very much for introducing us to these issues. You've very correctly drawn attention to the borrowing and the crowding out effect, because I've noticed that on the last 3 days, the government has been at pains to try and explain that it will not crowd out private borrowing or whatever it is, and they are indicating to the fact that actual borrowing may not really be 15 trillion or whatever they've indicated. And thank you for drawing attention to the 4 C's. Your 4 C's are very benign. In government or in India, we believe in other C's which are not benign, and they are things like the CBI and the CBC. I don't want to name the third one. So anyway, your C's are very benign. With this, I thank you very much. I will now call upon Mr. Manish Tripathi to take us through his views about what the budget held for us. Manish, all yours.
Thank you, Vinodji. It's a pleasure to be with you. Greetings from Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, ICS, for arranging this webinar. And first of all, our greetings to Honorable High Commissioner P. Kumaran sir. It's great to have you in the audience. And of course, greetings to all the people who have gathered, taken out time from their busy schedule. Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce views all the budgets very, very carefully, and we give our opinion as required. But definitely, India budget, Vinodji, is very important for us because we are Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce, right? And then we are ardently, eagerly expecting the Singapore budget coming very soon. Our job is to marry the business sectors. So our perspective from the SICCI side will be more on the business angle, how the business views this, how SMEs view this. And Vinodji has given me some points specifically on the crypto part, and I'll definitely talk about that. But before that, let us paint the big animal picture. There are close to 220,000 SMEs in Singapore. They are responsible for more than 90% of job creation here. And it is very important that the chambers, the three chambers, Singapore Indian Chamber being one of them, the three TACs, look after the community and how the community finds benefit out of the budget, and then moves forward in creating business ties between India and Singapore. Important points, which I will try to break this into simpler pieces. This is a CapEx push budget, and I'm preaching the choir here. Everybody knows that the 7.5 lakh crores, which is being pushed as expenditure, will have a multiplier effect. I read somewhere the estimates are the multiplier effect could be between 5 to 7 times. So that 7.5 lakh crores can become 30 lakh crores as it multiplies within the economy. And just to give some idea, as PM announced the Gati Shakti, or the FM announced the Gati Shakti program, people who understand Hindi, it's good, but Gati Shakti means speed or velocity, and Shakti is power. So this program is about creating velocity and power together in 7 sectors: roads, railways, airports, ports, mass transport, waterways, and logistics. So as this money is spent, it's going to create jobs. People will have salary or more salary. They will go and buy more clothes, shoes, go to the malls. Hence, the inventory will come down. The manufacturing indices will become better. Factories will have more production, and so on and so forth, right? So we from the chamber welcome this. Now, Vinodji, you very rightly said there's this classical debate forever about growth and managing fiscal deficit. But the need of the hour, we feel, is to do CapEx push. Post, as we come out of the pandemic, I mean, hopefully we come out of the pandemic very soon, to reignite the economy, the government should spend, and that is what we see. So this is a welcome move. The second part, a couple of other important parts we see, which I think people may have missed in a very complex budget document, is the SEZ Act is to be replaced with a new legislation. And I think the business community in Singapore, and of course in India and other places of the world, should welcome this. The new legislation will cover all large existing and new industrial enclaves, and it will enhance competitiveness of exports. I think this also is a very welcome part of the budget. Another very important part which we figured out is going to help the economy locally in India is we found that post office banking boost is a part of this budget. 100% of India's 1.5 lakh post offices will be onboarded on core banking system. I think this is a great move to make banking all pervasive. Everybody has a bank account. The subsidies or the benefits go directly to the bank accounts. I think this is a great move by the government of India. Digital rupee. The government announced that RBI is going to come out with its own digital currency. I mean, China has done it about 2 years back. So India doing a digital currency is a very good move. A very important point on Atmanirbhar defense manufacturing. 68% of defense procurement budget has been earmarked for domestic private industry. Again, a good news to spur the economy. That's a very large number, 68% or close to 60%. So there is this debate about what is not there. And I think, Vinodji, you very rightly pointed out about the learning loss. It's also very dear to our hearts, learning loss. And I was also stunned by what Barnali said, that it's going to take 10 years to come to the pre-pandemic path of growth. I will go and do my maths, and I'm sure she's right. But this is an amazing statistics. But I think this is not only for India. I think this would be, imagine what is happening to other economies which will not grow at 8.2% or 8%. There are other economies who possibly would grow slower. So India has a chance to see that amongst other developing countries, it surges ahead, because India is still growing at about 8% plus. Now, coming back to crypto. Again, Vinodji, you pointed out very well. The moment an industry or any asset is taxed by the government, there is an underlying legitimacy that is imparted to that asset. I mean, till now, all the trading platforms of crypto were either banned, or there was various limitations of how they can operate and whatnot. India coming out in the budget and saying that cryptocurrency will have a tax of 30% and a TDS or a surcharge of 1% is a great thing to happen for this industry. A little bit on crypto. It has 6 parameters. Cryptos are underlying, it's a blockchain technology. The blockchain is the key thing. That's the internet of value. Crypto is an offshoot of blockchain. And blockchain also brings you NFTs. It also gives you various digital assets, smart contracts. Crypto tokenomics is just one part. So blockchain is there to stay, right? The whole doubt is about the crypto economics. Crypto has immutability, enhanced security, distributed ledger systems, consensus, which is called proof of work, or proof of stake. So you don't need a centralized person to say the check is honored, check should not be honored, it is a right check or not, right instrument for it's not. It is a distributed ledger system with consensus where a community votes and says this money should be honored. So it takes away the centralized system. So remember this, I'm going to come back to this. The distributed system or decentralized system, faster settlement. Now, if you see out of these 6, all look quite okay, right? The only problem, there are 2 problems here. The governments worldwide do not like the decentralized approval system. They do not like that a currency token moves around in the ecosystem where there is no centralized authority to say this is the right instrument or not. Various issues, it's a good point. There has to be compliance because we don't know the money is flowing for what reason. I mean, AML is very important. Money could flow for various reasons which are not goodness, drug money, money funding terrorists, and so on and so forth. So the crypto part will evolve. We feel in the business community that this train has left the station. Now we all have to find out how to make this more ethical in a way. There has to be more, there are more rules. But the first step is recognizing it exists. At this moment, it's only about $5 to $10 billion of transaction. Nobody knows, how many cryptos or what's the transaction. But the blockchain is here to stay. So various other digital assets on blockchain are here to stay. So it's a very good move, giving confidence to various development institutes, startups, platforms to see that Government of India at least has started taxing them and hence giving them legitimacy. I will just end by saying the business community always wants a little bit of help to reignite the economy. Either we can look back and see in the budget what has not been said, or we can just take it as a fact and see what has been said and what is the goodness for the community. We feel in the chamber that the CapEx push is a good thing. Gati Shakti programs, 7 focus areas are very good. Of course, there is deficit funding, and that will always happen, growth versus deficit. SEZ Act is a very good one. Crypto is good. Post office, core banking in post offices, making it all pervasive is very good. Digital currency by RBI is very good. An Atmanirbhar defense manufacturing program and allocating 60% of defense procurement through local manufacturing is also very nice. So we, all in all, we feel 8.2% growth, target growth is real, and we will help the Singapore SMEs or Singapore business communities to link with Indian community, business community, and see that they work together. And hence, we also have a drag-on effect in the Singapore economy. Vinodji, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you for that wonderful exposition on what I would call this animal called crypto, this digital currency, which till maybe only 2 years back, maybe 3 years back, was being considered as an outlaw. Lots of central banks were very wary of it, were watching it with great amount of caution. And now that the government has taken the initiative and gone forward is a wonderful, and thank you very much for giving us that very good overview of what it is all about. So good of you to have done that. Now I'll call upon our fourth speaker today. We have Dr. Sachin Shukla. Would you like to share the stage with us, Dr. Shukla?
Thank you so much, Mr. Rai. Thank you, Dr. Palit, ISAS, and Siki. It's a pleasure to be interacting via this forum. Mr. Rai, let me just give a brief backdrop, and then from there on try to look at the budget and what it's trying to do. If I look at from October 2021 till now, portfolio investors have sold close to about 76,000 crores in equities in India, about 9,000 crore in debt, right? If I look at the trade balance, it's been about $19.5 billion a month. And FX reserves have come off a bit. Inflation is at its upper end, bond yields are up, like Radhika mentioned. Crude oil is on the boil, $90 to $93 per barrel. And yet, if you look at the rupee, it's remarkably stable, right? And let me quote George Allen Sr. He said, "Forget the past. The future will give you plenty to worry about," right? With that, let's look at what's happening right now. I mean, we have a geopolitical situation, Russia and Ukraine. The US believes there could be an invasion any day now. And then there is a very, very aggressive Fed, which is threatening to pull off the liquidity rug, right, off our feet. So Mr. Rai, let me look at the budget now with this lens. A lot has been said on what this budget is. Let me say what this budget is not. Let's have that very clear. I believe the budget has not tried to be populist. And you know, Mr. Rai and all of us know, in a noisy democracy, it is very difficult to really be able to shrug off these pulls and pressures of polls. We know we have some polls coming up, including UP, Punjab, and all of that. And therefore, being able to avoid the tendency to just spend your way out of trouble, right? Throw more money at the problem and then maybe burden the exchequer for the future. I think this budget has not done that. If I look at another thing, which to me is very, very important, before we came into this budget, world over, there was this tsunami of bad economic ideas, right? People are talking about tax the super rich. Look at US, look at Europe. Even in India, we had some very bad and long abandoned ideas, such as imposition of wealth tax, estate tax, which we've abolished, right? People were clamoring, advocating for bringing them back. And these were doing the rounds at a serious level in the policy circles. And therefore, to me, not burdening the middle class or the super rich by any new levies. So no tax and spray. I think that's another big positive. So this budget was not about tax and spray. It was not populist. It was not trying to go after the super rich, looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. So therefore, no flashes of red, nor did it try to turn green. I mean, by overdoing that ESG thing and then trying to come up with some very new things that could have probably added to the uncertainty. So with that, let me say that economics is essentially a zero-sum game, right? And it involves complex policy trade-offs and payoffs. So the choice with the government was essentially, if you have to boost growth, and this is what they had chosen at the last budget as well, to choose capex or consumption, right? And as you know, Mr. Rai, there is a saying, I don't know who to attribute it to, but it goes like this: that if all economists are laid end to end, they will point in all different directions. So there has been this school of thought that capex is probably a better way to go. Mr. Tripathi spoke about the multiplier. In the Indian economy, it is documented. We have this multiplier starting from 2.45, going all the way to say 2.95. And over a period of time, this can become bigger. The other choice was consumption. And consumption, like Mr. Tripathi said, the multiplier is less than 1. So every rupee you spend, you get a lesser bang for the buck. And another very important thing that I want to highlight for everybody who's listening to this is the choice is that if you give an incremental rupee and you're trying to address a K-shaped recovery, the other school of thought is give more money directly into pockets. But if you do that, while the understanding is the marginal propensity to consume is higher at the lower income segments, but with 2 years of the pandemic of the virus, will your marginal propensity to save not be more than marginal propensity to consume? So the point that was being debated in policy circles was that if you give an additional rupee into pockets, whether it is farmers or middle class or whichever section, will they not end up saving and therefore defeat your entire purpose of giving the economy a consumption boost? So that is point number 2. The third point that I want to mention, Mr. Rai, is capex is not only about government. In fact, government is one of the players that can drive capex. If I look at the private sector activity, steel, cement, chemicals, electronics, we are seeing a wave that has started in terms of capital expenditure. Another very important thing that people tend to miss out on is, if I were to look at the private equity and venture capital space, India has seen investments of $70 billion in calendar 21. And this can unleash entrepreneurial potential. This can create jobs. And then mind you, there were about 1,900 deals, which is a record last year. And this was led by consumer technology, so IT or software as a service. And this is on top of $62 billion that we got in 2020. So the point I'm making is that there is an underlying activity that is happening from the private sector. There are some sectors where capacity utilization is still a problem, but in certain segments, this has already started. And I believe with the government trying to crowd in, trying to lead the way via infrastructure spending, we will see this only accelerate. And governments cannot create jobs. I think that's something that we need to understand fundamentally. It is the private sector, it is private sector activity that creates jobs, and that leads to that whole virtuous cycle. If I look at the, say, corporate India, balance sheets are now deleveraged. Companies, if I look at their ROEs, are greater than 10%, right? Double-digit ROEs. And debt to equity has gone down to less than 1 for a lot of sectors in the manufacturing space and others. If I look at the other piece of the equation, banks have provisioned about 70% for bad loans. And I think they are in a position to lend for the cycle. So the point I'm making is the government has made the right choice, given the multipliers, given the private sector activity. And there is this lag that CAPEX works with, and which is why the government needed to take that lead, which it has done so. And I think this will also take care of the K-shaped recovery problem. Let me give an example. The employment elasticity, which means every 1% increase in, say, cost saving associated with infrastructure spending or improvement, what is the percentage change in employment? Studies have documented that a 10% rise in infra spending will give you, say, 5.5% more jobs, right? And this is for roads. There is study that talks about railways, waterways, and stuff like that. So the basic point I'm making is what CAPEX does is not only it kickstarts that virtuous cycle on growth, but also creates employment, and it doesn't do it only for the middle class or in certain cities. These projects across, Mr. Tripathi spoke about the Gati Shakti thing, so roads, railways, all these programs are distributed across the country, and construction employs about 12-13% of the labor force. And these jobs will be created in the hinterland, across states, across India. So this is more equitable, and therefore I believe that this probably was the right choice. This will get the private sector energized and continue moving forward on the CAPEX thing. Radhika spoke about 4 C's, I guess. Let me add one more thing, one more C from my side, which is consistency. The private sector and investors look at consistency and stability. What this budget has done is that it has shown that the government is sticking to the supply side push. Why is it important? We are seeing 40-year highs in inflation in US, in Europe, and everywhere else, right? So inflation is the in thing. Everybody is talking about it. If you were to put a lot of money like we did in post-GFC and some of the other periods in the Indian economy, it could have been inflationary and complicated the path. And therefore, by choosing to spend on CAPEX, you are also demonstrating that quality of spending is what you are looking at. So if you look at revenue expenditure growth, it is flat, not even growing at 1%. Whereas CAPEX, there are various ways in which you can look at the CAPEX number. Mr. Rai, you know this better than all of us here. If I were to make those one-off adjustments, Air India and some of these things, IBER and all that, the number could vary from 12% to the 25% and the 35% B versus B. So the point is, let's not quibble about the percentage change, but let's look at it directionally. This directionally is the right thing to do. And I believe this is going to be very, very critical. One important thing that I want to talk about, Mr. Rai, is look at the interest expenditure that we have for the current fiscal year budgeted for F23. Over 9 lakh crore. To give a context to this number, the size of the entire Indian economy, India's GDP, was 6 lakh crore and some change in 1991, right? So that is how big this interest burden is. If you're borrowing so much, I mean, we are borrowing 40 lakh crore, and this is the size of the Indian economy in 2006. So India's GDP was slightly lower than this number in 2006. Those were the heydays when the economy was growing at, say, 7-8% every single year. And therefore, I believe that quality of spending really matters. And therefore, even if the number is, say, 12% or 14% YY, the point is directionally we are doing the right thing. We are spending on the right areas rather than spending on revenue expenditure items. The last bit I want to highlight is, it's already been spoken about, so I'll take maybe 30 seconds. The center-state tango on CAPEX is very, very important because the fiscal cycles often are in opposite directions. So if the center spends but states don't, it defeats the impulse on CAPEX. So the 1 lakh crore additionally provided to state governments, I think will go long way in ensuring that the central and fiscal cycles on capex are not antagonistic. So with that, I'll take a pause and then back to you.
Dr. Shukla, thank you very much, because you're drawing attention to the fact that whatever may be said about the budget, despite the fact that important polls were around the corner, it certainly was not populist. And yes, in terms of consistency of policy planning, the government has done very well. So the worst of the critics cannot quibble about that factor at the least. And I think government was also very concerned about the fact that increased spending, where the marginal propensity to save would be higher than what it would be to consume, was the thing which made government do what they have done in the past. We get on to the last speaker for the day, which is our very own MS Dhoni, because Amitabh Palit is as good a finishing batter as Dhoni was. So he's going to be the final finisher for this thing. Amitabh, all yours, the stage.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. And that was indeed a wonderful compliment. I hope I can live up to your expectations as far as being a finisher is concerned, which is going to be tough because there have been such distinguished panelists who have come before me. And I think when we got around to discussing about this particular event, which is a regular activity from ISAS, we expected that we will have a wholesome discussion like we always do, but I think the discussion that we have had today has really exceeded our expectations. It's so far been a tremendous learning ground from me. So what I'll try to do, and before I come to what I want to set out in the context of the themes that I want to bring in, I just wanted to allude to two things which have come up in the panelists' observations till now, both of which I think are very important to ISAS from an institutional perspective and on which we would hope to stay engaged with the panel in the months to come. The first of this is the discussion that has already started taking shape around virtual digital assets, the digital rupee and the cryptocurrencies, an area of work which we are hoping to pursue actively at ISAs. And we would hope to stay engaged with all of you on that. And secondly, Manish, I'm very glad you alluded to the revamped legislation that is in the pipeline, replacing the special economic zones, which I think comprises a great basket of opportunities and at the same time very interesting challenges that this omnibus legislation might throw up from a regulatory, political, as well as socioeconomic perspective. I want to come into one particular segment of the conversation surrounding the budget, which is perhaps more on the periphery, but nonetheless tends to affect the core as actively as it could, and that is typically the politics that one encounters. I mean, in India, an exercise like the budget can never really escape the conversation surrounding politics. And every year in India, we have elections coming up. So inevitably, either before the budget or soon after the budget, there are Indian elections that happen in important states of the country, if not the general election. And this year, it was all the more so. We have two of the most important states in the northern part of the country, Uttar Pradesh and Punjab, along with Uttarakhand as well as Goa, going to elections. And with the general elections to the Indian Parliament just a little more than 2 years away, probably the Indian political landscape, on which again ISAS has a very interesting discussion coming up tomorrow, probably the Indian political landscape has started crystallizing in a fashion which will have some elements to throw up for the elections that follow after 2 years. Now, in this context, how does a ruling party go about preparing the budget? I think the challenge for the finance minister in this regard is to first stay to the fundamentals as closely as possible, because ultimately, from a ministry perspective, from a public policy perspective, the budget is a statement of accounts, and that statement of accounts needs to have as much of an honest and effective flow of the expenditure and revenue as possible. The conditions for the last 2 years have been exceptional. I think this year, preceded by the budget that we had last year, the two full budgets come on the back of the COVID-19 taking different shapes. As the Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong mentioned at the onset of the Omicron outset, that this virus has continued taking us by surprise. And that is, I think, a global feeling. The virus really has continued taking everybody by surprise by entering into various stages of mutation. Now, when India went into this budget, there were certain options. I think it's important to note this because this is in a political context that I'm sharing. There were certain options which were already exhausted. And by saying this, what I mean to is that when COVID first struck, and there was this huge exodus of the labor going back to the villages, and then thereafter enterprises closing, people finding themselves out of jobs, in some cases, food supplies getting affected. The government actually came out, like governments across the world, with expansionary fiscal policies and welfare supportive measures to ensure that the dispossessed and the displaced don't run out of cash with them and they get as much support as possible. Now, it is possible to describe these as populist measures, and it is possible to also take the point that, well, okay, these are the ones which the state governments and the central government would have taken to the people over the last 1.5 years when they went to the elections. Now, the point is that if that is the narrative that is taken, then one has to understand that, of course, such kind of measures can't keep happening over and over again. There is a limit, there is a saturation to this. A government can give support insofar as cash support and expansionary fiscal support is concerned. At some stage, the narrative has to change, the direction has to change, and yet, I think as Dr. Manmohan Singh, India's one of the most prominent finance ministers of this generation, has mentioned, that good economics is not necessarily bad politics. I think that is a sense which finance ministers probably needed to keep in mind, as on this occasion, that good economics has to come in without abandoning welfare economics. Financial prudence and fiscal prudence has to come in without giving up on the main objective ahead, which is pushing aggregate demand. And yet, those should not go down as politically counterproductive steps, in the sense that those should not create a negative band and brand of politics around the country, which contributes to short-changing and short-selling in any number of ways. So I think in that respect, the only way forward was pushing ahead on a job-creating program. And that job-creating program clearly had to come through activities which would promote jobs and livelihoods. So we see this enormous scale and step up in capital expenditure, which is pushing infrastructure. I think this is an activity which, under the current circumstances in India, can be very well politically justified. Because to a very large extent, last 1 to 2 years, the government has given as much support as possible to the people in agriculture, to the migrant labor who have gone back. If we look at the state government policies, industrial policies, outside of budget policies, a number of them have actually focused on the welfare of MSMEs over the last 16 to 18 months, because these are the enterprises which have faced maximum hardships during the period that we have seen. So to that extent, the government cannot actually be faulted for not having addressed the concerns of the people who have been hit the most, but they can't just keep hand-holding. They can't just keep pushing people through an umbrella or covering them all up and then expect that this is the handheld community which will produce 9% growth year after year, decade after decade. That cannot happen. I think the government has consciously taken note of the fact that this is probably the last budget during the turn of the government, because the next budget again will be getting kind of uncomfortably close to the general elections that India will have in 2024. This is probably the last budget where it can really grow that strong and sturdy push to infrastructure and produce what many of you alluded to as the virtuous multiplier effects. So much so that by the time India actually gets into elections 2 years down the line, these multipliers should have produced the dividends. And the dividends should have been there to be seen. I still remember that when the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government was in command and faced that year of tremendous stagnation, 2000, back to back with a number of exogenous shocks, the Kargil war, the Gujarat earthquake, the Odisha supercyclone, the parliament attack, and so on and so forth, and economic growth had plummeted below 4%. It came out with this massive infrastructure programs, the north-south and east-west corridors and the golden quadrilaterals, which started producing results by the time India went into elections in 2003. But unfortunately, because of a rather glorified campaign of the benefits, it didn't connect to the people the way it should have. But otherwise, the economic results were very much visible on the table. The multiplier effects have produced results. So I think there is still, if history and economics have to be taken together on the same platform, we can expect these results to come through within the next 2 years, and the government can go to the people with a positive message, which is also popularly, not populist, but politically sound and acceptable. So to me, that has been the great political understanding of this budget as it went forward. But what I find in another sense quite striking about this budget is that I think this budget actually is the first budget which marks the beginning of India's journey to a net zero economy. I think we often overlook the fact that this budget was presented in the context of the COP26 summit in Glasgow, which took place in November last year, and where the kind of commitments that India made are not just ambitious, but also very, very challenging in terms of having accepted its own limitations, because the challenge of transition to non-fossil fuel vis-a-vis for fossil fuel will remain with India for a very long time, for obvious reasons. But in spite of facing those challenges, India went ahead with those commitments, made decisions to the extent of having nearly 50% of its energy requirements from non-fossil fuel sources by the end of the current decade, cutting down the carbon intensity of the economy by almost half of what it is right now. Now, all these require not just money being put into important programs, but also making the stakeholders get really convinced and connected to these commitments. Because unless businesses, unless industries, unless institutions really understand the importance of serving the goal of sustainable development, India cannot achieve that target. To that extent, I think there are these little bits of very interesting proposals, special mobility zones with zero fossil fuel, the National Ropeways Development Program. I was actually very surprised by this. I mean, ropeways, in a sense, are perhaps the most ecological mode of transportation that can happen, not just in the hills, but even in congested urban areas. And they can really serve great purpose to that extent. The fact that a battery swapping policy, you alluded to that, Manisha, Radhika, you also did. The battery swapping policy is actually so simple that I am surprised why this was never thought of before. And there are certain state governments who are really working on it purposefully. And let's also not forget the fact that this didn't come out of the blue. This comes out of a series of policies which the states and central are already working on. So to that extent, this policy is just upgrading the efforts, which are already active in India, which are already being implemented with as much of purpose as possible. But having said that, I think we need to wait and watch for actually what the implementation is on ground, because I suppose from now onward, if India is really serious about achieving the sustainable development goals, it will really need to push up the monitoring very, very effectively. That monitoring might not necessarily be in terms of awarding A-star ratings to projects getting environmental clearances, but that monitoring has to be more in terms of what's the bottom-up reflection and commitment to social development is, at least in terms of some quantifiable outcomes. So that is where I would probably end my submission. I hope, sir, I was able to provide some constructive finish to this excellent batting lineup that we have had. Thank you so much.
Absolutely excellent. Dhoni has competition, even if he is retired, so what? but we have an absolutely stellar panel today, drawn attention to everything. And Amitendu, you very rightly said that let's hope, let's all be optimistic of the fact that next 2 years, this job creation policy will, fructify and give us results by the time, well, yes, next year will be a budget, but that will be close to it. And probably in 2024, we might just have only a vote on account. We may not have a full budget at all. So a net zero policy that the government is following and you're drawing attention towards this was really very wonderful. Now, we still have about half an hour to go, and we have some interesting questions which have come up. Let's take the first one, that the government has adopted a top-down approach via public capital expenditure to crowd in private investment. It's the reverse of it, despite the fact that we've had a huge quantum of FDI which has flown in. Could the prescription given for cure be flawed here, particularly when CapEx investments come with a long gestation period before it can reap rewards? Who will take this? Dr. Shukla, Radhika? Either of you?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Mr. Shukla.
Yeah, I think a minute each.
All right. Thank you. So I think I mentioned this point that CapEx does work with a lag. If I were to look at the capacity utilization rates right now in the economy, the average is, say, mid-60s. And we need capacity utilization levels to go anywhere up to, say, 80-82% before we can start seeing the impact of that on growth, on jobs and things like that. But having said that, very often looking at averages is also sometimes doesn't really give you a complete picture. And that's why I pointed out towards the fact that if you were to look at the capex in certain segments, look at steel, look at chemicals, look at the electronics industry, we are beginning to see the seeds of the new capex cycle, right? There are investments that have been announced by prominent industrial groups, including the likes of Aditya Birla and some of these other, industrial houses. We're also seeing investments being announced in the green economy space. We have seen announcements via PLI. We've seen the kind of enthusiasm across sectors in the PLI scheme. And at the same time, I mentioned the investments in the PVC segment. I think people often overlook that. So what we got in, say, just CY21, $70-odd billion, is many times over what the government is promising to give via PLI, right? So if you look at $70 billion in that context, I think the PLI pales in comparison, because the PLI is spread over 5 years across sectors, whereas we've got 62 billion already in 2020. I agree that Reliance alone accounted for about 26 billion of that. But if I were to look at, say, calendar year 21, we've had 1,900 odd deals, and across consumer technology and across other spaces. We can argue over the efficacy in terms of employment creation, how many jobs versus the old economy. But the point is, this is unleashing entrepreneurial potential. This is creating jobs. And I believe that while we look at only the capex part from the government, the infrastructure spending, etc., the Gati Shakti and all of that will be spoken about or make headlines. I think let's not forget this space within the private sector and also the private equity and venture capital bets. So yes, it works with a lag, and which is why we needed the government to take the lead, which it has done. But I'm sure that it will only catalyze the capex that we're seeing across segments in the private sector. And then some of the sectors I mentioned has capacity utilization levels of over 80-82% already as we speak. And then the kind of investments that we're seeing in the startups and all of that.
Radhika, would you like to share your views on this?
Sure, I'll just very quickly add. I think I fairly agree with what Dr. Shukla mentioned. And I think, again, budget is but an event. I would think a lot of announcements now are, material announcements are happening outside the budget. And this is interesting that this CAPEX announcement has come against a time when you have broader frameworks, right? So you have this national infrastructure pipeline, which basically is in charge of recognizing where the money is supposed to go. Then you also have an asset monetization program. You also have the PLI scheme, as Dr. Shukla mentioned. So there is a lot of hand-holding going on by other routes as well, and all of this is supply driven, to mean that you provide the right architecture, you provide. Of course, I think cost of financing was cheaper last year. It's going to get more expensive now, but at least there are many modes of engaging the private sector. And CAPEX, I would think right now, I was looking at the scorecard for the asset monetization program, and it does look like since it was announced perhaps in August last year, roads seem to have seen quite a bit of assets, ports as well, and so has some of the airports. So that is all happening on the supply side. So I think that part of the framework has really done very well, and a lot of changes happening. Again, I could bring in things like IBC and all of that. But for the private sector to fully participate, I think they also need demand visibility. And that bit, I think, is still to fall into place. I mean, over the course of this discussion that we had, we did mention K-shaped recovery a few times. So I think either on the domestic side or on the export side, the private sector will need to see very clear demand revival to really go full gung-ho over spending. So till such time, I think they will avail of, because their own books are better now, in a better shape, they would avail of the opportunities. But to really go very strongly into it, I would think that demand side also needs to revive, for us to see a virtuous cycle between private-public CAPEX.
It's an important issue. Dr. Bhandari, would you like to say anything?
I actually, Radhika said it. I just wanted to say that the private final consumption expenditure still hasn't caught up to the pre-pandemic period, and that is the largest share of the GDP. So the demand side, the supply side initiatives are good, but along that we have to balance the demand side, and I have to balance the demand side. So exactly what Radhika was saying. And it's not, while there is something that is not been mentioned in the budget, but there is this this initiative by the government called the e-Shram, which is our sort of our social registry for all the informal workers, which has been, it's a pretty novel exercise that has been done by the central government to registry almost all informal workers, gig workers, small farmers. So we are, I mean, it's not using that platform to actually deliver payments to them or provide some social support for them would be nice, because these are very difficult times for the workers. And I do want to say that NCR does conducts business expectation survey around 6 cities every quarter. Our sentiments consistently show that sentiments of large firms are better than small firms with annual turnover of 100 crores. And not only that, they diverged for the most part of it during the pandemic, and they had narrowed in the second quarter, but they diverged again in the third quarter. So the shock is there. And I do want to add here about job creation, that though this doesn't answer the question, but I want to add here is that we just remember our employment elasticity, especially for industry, is very low. In services also is very low. There's a lot of literature on this. Between 4, 5, and 11, 12, jobless growth was, even though we had one of the highest growth rates, jobless growth did characterize the economy. I mean, even if it's growth by itself, I think we need to be careful when we think about it. But growth is a necessary condition. But is it a sufficient condition or not is something that we need to think about as we go forward. Sorry for taking up.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thank you for that intervention. Another one is, what do you think is the single most important factor driving the Indian economy down? And if you put your finger onto it, does the government have the political muscle to tackle it? Who would like to take this? Amitendu?
Well, sir, I would hazard a guess, but of course,
Manish may also like to come in.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, what I probably say is is my location of a particular factor, and that might not be what others might think necessarily the correct one. I think, and let me just put the context in which I'm trying to argue this out. I think what we all understand and accept is the fact that like all economies and the world economy itself, the Indian economy will never be like what it was before. I mean, it will never be like even what it was 10 years before. There are very significant changes that have taken place, and these are not connected to the COVID-19 pandemic or anything like that, but these are purely structural changes, attitudinal changes, and even sociological changes within India, which have made an enormous impact upon its economy. Now, the upshot of that has been that probably the entire idea of the labor market has changed. So the way people look at jobs, and we had had this tremendous discussion on jobs just before, the way people look at jobs have changed. In fact, probably this refrain that there are hardly any jobs, but there's a lot of work. I think that has become a very important phrase to be understood, because indeed there is a lot of work in India. And this is in fact where a lot of entrepreneurial energy has gone into the growth of startups. India very soon is going to get around 100 unicorns, which is a phenomenal achievement from an emerging market economy. So the question over here is that for running those startups and the connected startups which are going to flow, is there enough capable people in the country? I think if that is a question to which we can have a conclusive answer, then we'll get an answer to many of the other questions that we have around us. Why aren't many people developing sufficient incomes? For the very simple reason, they are not fit for the kind of jobs that are high income generating. And whether they will be able to fit into those jobs at any place or time. No, this is no more a question of just they're getting skilled and reskilled and being pushed into higher skill jobs. No, I think this is a fundamental transformation that has happened in India, because there are very bright, very capable people who have become entrepreneurs and who have produced these startups. The startups are creating jobs, they're creating wealth, they're creating profits. But whether they are capable of taking the labor market and the workforce along with them is, I think, more than $1 million. It's $1 billion question. And that might eventually become the biggest public policy challenge for India to handle.
Manish, would you like to add to it?
Yes, Vinodji, sure. It's a wonderful question. India being the sixth largest, a very large economy, PPP-wise, maybe number 3, if I remember right. And I'm not an economist. I'm actually surrounded by a very august gathering. I'm more of a technologist and a business person. But Vinodji, India or any other economy does not have a problem which is not different from the other. Borrowing, spending, fiscal deficit, growth plan, capex. You know, this is all economies grapple with all this. And I would try and say something very different here. I think India suffers from a very vibrant democracy. What I'm saying, it's like an oxymoron, right? We have a very, very vibrant democracy. And it's a federal state, federal form of government. There are many, like land is a state subject, for example. So the goal congruence of policies, or the velocity or the vector alignment of policies in India actually is one of the main reasons why the company is not able to chug along as faster as somebody else. And we all know, you know, a strong center cannot implement some very, very good or populist policies. I'm using the word populist, but I don't mean it in a detrimental way, if the state governments do not have the will. So the first thing, because it says single most, right? The first is, I think we've got a very vibrant democracy. It works in our favor sometimes, and sometimes it does not. And that's the reason the vectors are not aligned, and we do not see the speed or the velocity which our economy should see. That's one part. And if I had to put a couple of others, just 2 more, Vinodji. The second is, Dr. Shukla very rightly said, the growth is spurred actually by the private sector, or FDI plus private sector put together. And I'm very happy to see that India created 80 unicorns in the last 12 to 18 months. I think the highest in the world. India has 140 billionaires, and that's over so many years, decades. But India created 80 unicorns. Unicorns not only create wealth, innovation and ideas, but it also creates a lot of jobs. So innovation, as Amitendu very rightly pointed out, a lot of skills and talent, but that talent and the skill has to be in the private sector, should be given enough leeway to create more and more unicorns and investments. And hence, then you will find that the whole speed of economy will go forward.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you very much for that. Okay, let's take another one, which says that in a country where a huge proportion of the economy is in the informal sector, and the pandemic has impacted the unskilled laborers rather harshly, wasn't it necessary for the government to directly intervene to create jobs? Or is it fair to say the budget has, in a sense, not given social support or welfare measures, which was supposed to have been the due focus as against CapEx? Dr. Bhandari, would you like to take this?
Yeah, I think I'll take this one. I think my co-panelists have already mentioned this, and I want to re-emphasize this again. The government cannot create jobs. The government can create enabling conditions which can create jobs. So there's a difference here. And I think that, I think Dr. Shukla has very emphatically told us now that the CapEx can create jobs. And again, if you go back to simple Keynesian during the Depression, I mean, not that India has any depression-like conditions, but I'm just saying that during the Depression, the policy recommendation was dig ditches if you have to create jobs. So in this case, if the government is spending especially on roads, something like that, immediately construction, which is the largest employer of unskilled jobs even, it actually has an immediate positive and multiplier impact. So it's not I think the challenge is not about what the government has done. The government has done, from both economic sense, it does make the right thing. What it is trying to do is, what enabling conditions is ease of doing business, have business reforms, and democracy is good in this way because democracy helps us to keep balanced out. So in the sense is the ease of doing business and enabling business reforms helps the government to create enabling conditions. I think that's one thing we have to remember. The third thing, I think the point of unicorns is important, but as a share of GDP, it's very small. And then secondly is what kind of impact does it have in employment? That's another thing. We know that the IT sector is good, but again, there's evidence that it only employs a very high labor, and the employment multiplier impact tend to be small. So I think, and what we see here is the industry is actually been, at least has been the one which has spurred and recovered much quicker than others. And manufacturing actually has the potential to create jobs, even though it's still been quite low in India. And remember, again, one of the medium-term challenges is technology, because technology could potentially attract only a particular kind of job. So schooling, we go back to the idea of schooling. Schooling is absolutely very important. The other important point is that creating jobs is, so not only do we have to, it's both a supply and demand problem, where you have to create jobs and you have to create skilled people to get those jobs. So there has to be a match between the supply and demand of labor. And the third point is that, a lot of, we didn't talk about it, but the underlying is that the, gig workers being created where you can get into temporary jobs. But in India, the problem is that majority are informal jobs, and majority of them are, and very poorly skilled informal jobs. So in this case, the question is of temporary workers, you have to provide, or we have to think about social security. If you compare to Singapore to India, or even the US one that I know better, the US market, social security is there, unemployment benefits is there, medical benefits is there. So the government has created If you think in the medium run, the government has created Ayushman Bharat, you may debate about the implementation, but the mechanisms are there. So health insurance, unemployment insurance is not there, but Atal Pension Yojana is another pension scheme. And now with the e-Shram, potential to create a platform of social registry for a complete support is there. So yes, the current budget is low on it, but it should have done a little more, I think, to provide support, especially on the demand side. But there are all these other policy interventions that are going on, which you look at as a collective can build up to be a very robust social security system as we go forward to a very changed labor market.
Mr. Rai, if I may.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So if we look at the COVID virus, it's not been an equal opportunity virus. I mean, the point I'm making is it goes disproportionately after the poor and hurts them more. We have seen this worldwide. Just to give you one example, the United States, which is the source of funds for the rest of the world and one of the most advanced economies, actually has been impacted or hurt with the highest number of infections, highest number of deaths, because it probably has one of the poorest average health standards in any of the major economies. And also, healthcare is not guaranteed in the US, unlike the European counterparts. So what it tells us is that while the virus has impacted lives much more in the older generation, but I think the younger people will feel the pinch in their livelihoods for a bigger duration in their working years. So there has been this study, and as you know, Mr. Rai, developing economies are getting impacted by the lack of schooling, and the impact is more than 2 times than an advanced economy. So some recent study done by IMF says that the pandemic era students could lose as much as $17 trillion in their lifetime earnings. And they cite evidence of the global financial crisis, where some disruption happened to schooling, education, etc., although it was a short period of time. But they can still see the damages that it does to livelihood. So I think we should be very, very cognizant of the fact that while lives have been lost, and in India we've lost 5 lakh lives, but I think it's very important to bear in mind that the impact on livelihoods, which is not visible, can be enormous over the next, say, 10 years. So if people lose out on skilling, the necessary social or educational skills, etc. And therefore, we need a comprehensive rewriting of the rules of the economy, right? The social contract has to be altered fundamentally. We need to take care of all the stakeholders. So it's not, even for corporates, it will not be only about shareholders. It will be about stakeholders. And therefore, this new social contract that I'm talking about is not just about higher taxes, more distribution, tax and spray and things like that, or a bigger welfare state. It basically has to fundamentally reorder and equalize how opportunity and security is distributed across the society. So I think this is one learning that we have from the pandemic, that we also need to be cognizant of lives and the invisible impact over time of the policy, and makes us think harder about the policy choices that we make today and the years after this budget. So the point I'm making is we need to look at the entire social contract, need to revisit and think in decades and not just 1 year or 2 years like we're talking right now in terms of the budget. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that intervention. I think we have time to take one more. Let's take this. What stops Indian agriculture from becoming part of a global value chain? You want to? Radhika, you want to take that?
Sure. I had a couple of things to say about the previous question.
Okay. Please go ahead with that also.
Sure. Couple of lines on that, and then we jump on to this one.
Sure.
So because I think one of the criticisms that is coming out of the budget is also that enough has not been done on the demand side. And when we see the demand side, we always boil down to the welfare programs. how much of money has been put in. But to give a context, I do think there is, to give you some numbers, about 0.4, 0.5% of GDP worth of room, a cushion in the math as it stands for the year that we're going into, the fiscal 23. And I think that has been kept there for a reason. And I think if, say, oil prices, I mean, we are at 90 plus now, if we do see it go to 100 plus and excise duties have to be cut, that cushion can be used. If you say the natural gas prices are going up, because of which fertilizer subsidies have to be raised, I think that there is cushion to do that. If we say Manrega needs more funding, which it did happen, same thing happened last year as well, or the year we are in, that is, that can be done as well. So I think while the push is on CAPEX, my gut feel is also that some of the welfare programs will require more money, and I think it will be put there eventually. Because even the CAPEX money that has been put in, I'm not very sure if beyond 60 to 70% of that will be dispersed. We have an absorption capacity issue as well. That's one. So coming back to the agriculture question, so I'm not sure if I'm best placed for that. I think Ms. Bhandari is perhaps better. But I would think that from the official push seems to be to promote more agricultural exports. I think to begin with, make that value proposition for the producers. And I think before we do that, that also entails some infra development, that also entails some quality checks. Things, I will take a very simple example like dairy. Again, not agriculture per se, but allied services. If you take dairy services, there is a lot of discussion now that India is in midst of with its FTA partners, more so Australia for one, right? Where we do import, but don't export, we don't export as much because there are some regulatory requirements that we don't fulfill. So that boils down to the fact that while we do want to be a part of the global cycle, I would think that it will require some investments, particularly to the sector, which will get the whole produce and yields and all of that up. I think it's sufficient now to fulfill domestic demand, but to export, I would think that more value addition in terms of food processing and all of that also needs to happen. That's about it from my end.
Dr. Bhandari, would you like to take on?
Good question. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll try. The agriculture value chains, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that as it was agriculture exports as a ratio to as a percentage of total merchandise goods exports actually has gone up from 9% to 14% of the last couple of years. I forget the years. My main point is that the government is taking up a lot of effort. If you read every day, just some tweets or something else even, and more news releases, the agriculture APEDA, that's the organization, I don't know the full form, but they are encouraging exports of both raw materials and food processing exports. So there is a lot of emphasis on that, and there's a lot of emphasis also on creating value chains. I think there's a lot to be gained, especially in terms of border trade with our neighbors, immediate neighbors, on trade there. And I think the government is the Act East policy, or the government is the policy to ease issues of border trade around, for the India's border regions, could also enable. I'm especially talking about the East here. I've done some work there. That's why I know that there's a lot of potential there for agro-processing. But the standard complaint is that food gets stuck while crossing and then they rot. So there is India exports, of course, onions to Bangladesh has been quite documented by the Bangladeshi Prime Minister. So the point is that what I'm trying to say is there is a lot of effort, but there is we need for any kind of value chains, we need to ease our border trade, and there I think there's a lot of potential there for improvement there. There's a lot of effort going on in Acting East, building roads, building infrastructure, so on and so forth, digitization and everything. But the actual crossing on the real side needs to be made easier. If that has to, we have to create value chains, and that's true. I think that would stand true not just about agriculture, but if you want to create electronic value chains or textiles value chains, any kind of value chains, you need to be easing up on your border trade.
Thank you for that. Well, we are at the end of time, but I at the peril of incurring the wrath of Jordan and Divya both, but there is this last one which I must permit. Manish, this is going out to you. What's the future of digital payments in India? Also, India and Singapore have announced plans to link their respective real-time payment systems. So the banker and Manish can take this on because that's the UPI and the Pay Now. What's the future of this? 60 seconds. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble for time.
30 seconds. Fantastic. Huge prospects. UPI, Pay Now, Rupee Pay, nets here, everything. So the digital payment is the announcement of digital currency and the digital payments are the two best things which will spur the economy at the ground level. We know that in India now, even people are taking donations for religious functions with QR code scanning. So that kind of economy, which removes a lot of hurdles as people start collecting payment on time and spurring the economy and the value chain of the cash, is the best thing which can happen. Singapore has one of the best technologies. They are a financial hub, not only for the traditional financing, but also for digital financing. We are urging all our members to see and jump on the bandwagon. But in summary, this is the best thing which will lubricate the economy between the two nations.
Thank you. Radhika, would you like to say something on this?
Not so much that. Perhaps the next question, which is probably a minute on that, which is on the digital rupee.
Digital rupee,
yeah.
The future of the digital rupee.
Yeah, perhaps that.
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, hardship to laymen. So I would just want to add here that because RBI had done a survey last year when this discussion was very much on the fore to say that digital currency might be in the offing, and what they had acknowledged in that RBI survey was that cash intensity in the system or cash usage is still very high. Digital usage is high, but that is not to replace what's happening on the cash side. So I don't think a CBDC or a digital rupee will necessarily be a hardship. It'll just be another mode by which payment can be made. And in fact, I think if I remember correctly, they are coming out with regulations or with measures whereby you don't need connectivity. Also, even proximity of phones, for that matter, can help transfer money. So I don't think it's a replacement. I think it's just a complementary move. It'll be a long time before we really turn digital fully because there are many unanswered questions on that front.
Oh, anyway, I think I've been a bad timekeeper. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting discussion. We could have gone on and on. You've been a wonderful panel, very incisive, very insightful. And we have covered the whole gamut of issues and a very wide spectrum. Thank you very much for it. And I will now pass it on to Divya. All yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rai. We have now come to the end of the session. On behalf of ISAS and SICKI, I thank the panelists for the engaging and enriching discussion. We also thank all the participants for joining us in, and we look forward to seeing you all at our future events. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care and stay safe. Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.